Hi, I'm Jared Wolfe, Senior Editor and Assyriologist here at Museum of the Bible. As Senior Editor, I spend my days reading every letter of every word on every text panel, every label, every brochure, and every digital table in the museum. As an Assyriologist...
How old are the green ones?
No, wait a minute. Assyriologist. As an Assyriologist, I study the ancient cultures of Assyria and Babylonia, two cultures that had a major impact on ancient Israel and that show up in some significant ways in the biblical text. I find those ancient stories in texts and artifacts here at the museum, and I bring my favorites to you right here on The Bible Is So. Today I want to talk about arrowheads. I'm standing here in our long-term exhibit, partnered with the Israel Antiquities Authority, in front of a special display dedicated to the many invasions and conquests in the land of Israel at the hands of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. These arrowheads come from two different periods. Let's start with the ones on the bottom. These come from the famous Siege of Lakish. Now, Lakish was a heavily fortified city in Judah that was besieged by the Assyrians sometime around 701 BC. What prompted the invasion was that Hezekiah had allied himself with Egypt, thereby breaking his bonds or his oaths of loyalty to the Assyrians. This required punishment. Sennacherib, when he came through Judah, had destroyed many of the other towns, but Lakish, being one of the most strongly fortified sites, held out for a long time. The Siege of Lakish was massive. Even today, you can still see the ancient siege ramp that the Assyrians would have pushed their machines up to breach the walls. And these arrowheads, just a few of the hundreds that have been found at the site, give witness to the battle and where it was. But they also show us, between the two of these arrowheads, some of the evolution of arrows. Let's take a look. If you look at the two arrows, you can see these arrowheads have two faces, and they're slightly longer and thinner. Whereas the Babylonian arrows have three blades, or edges, or veins sometimes, and they're much smaller. The lower arrow group also has a tang. This is a small piece of metal that sticks off of the end, and they would have inserted this into the shaft and then tied it with some sort of string, or maybe used a bit of resin or bitumen for a glue. But that arrow would have been a little bit unstable. The Babylonian arrowheads, on the other hand, have a socket at the end into which you could fit the shaft and then crimp the metal down, making a very strong arrow. This would have allowed it to fly farther, to fly faster, and to fly straighter. You might say that the Babylonian arrowheads show an improvement in aerodynamics. Now, if we come back to speaking about arrows and bows, we can start thinking about where they show up in the Bible. When a lot of people think about the biblical text, it's slings and sling stones that come to mind. But arrows and bows are found throughout the biblical text and form some pretty important parts of it. One might think of the mother of all bows, the great bow that the God of Israel himself hangs in the sky after the flood in part of his pledge to Noah to never destroy the earth again with water. Today we call it the rainbow. You can also see bows and arrows in stories. The story of when Jonathan fires arrows into the field to warn David of Saul's wrath, or when the prophet Elisha has King Joash fire an arrow toward Aram to signify victory, and then thrash the floor with his quiver of arrows to show and symbolize the thrashing of Aram. We even have images of the God of Israel as an archer in the Psalms, firing his bolts against the enemies of Israel or the enemies of the psalmist. So we hear in the book of Job that the arrows of the Almighty have pierced him and he is drinking in their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me. This sort of vivid imagery, visceral imagery, even shows up in some of the quips of the sages. In a much later biblical book, in the Apocrypha, The Wisdom of Ben Sira says that like a bolt in the thigh, an arrow in the thigh is like gossip inside a fool. That's an image not many of us can identify with today. Arrows and bows are not commonplace in our world. But in ancient Israel and throughout ancient Israel's history, they would have been. And by learning about arrows and arrowheads, we can better understand the biblical stories themselves. And that's what makes the Bible so pointy.
To learn more about the museum or plan your next visit, go to museumofthebible.org.